It's great to be here, and this is a topic that we have been talking about for quite some time. I talked about it in my books that came out. The first one came out 14 years ago, and Jennifer and I began talking about this and really considering the option of writing a book about the topic way back around when the pandemic was starting, which has sort of slowed things down. But we are back with it, and we have Pat with us, and I'm going to just move on to, there we go. There's Jennifer and Pat, high above Lake Tahoe, not far from where you're all situated now. Jennifer, as you know, is director of the DEAR program, and Pat was the CEO for 30 years with Carol Woods Retirement Community in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And so Pat brings a very important dimension of expertise in helping lead a community that was not segregated, gated, locked in any way, on many sprawling acres of woods and ponds and beautiful grounds. And so we're tapping her wisdom for the book as well. So a lot of what I'll be talking about today has been developed by the three of us in creating that book, which is making its way toward a manuscript, I'm very happy to say. There's a lot here, so I'm going to move rather quickly. If anyone's really lost, I'm sure that Jennifer or Bradley or Casey is looking at the chat box, and you can always grab me if you have to. But if someone could let me know when I got about 10 minutes left, in case I haven't wrapped it up, we'll try to get to some discussion too. Let me start with the most important slide, though. This is maybe what we might call a culture change topic. And this is really not about bad people or bad care or bad practices. It's really meant to help us reflect on those systemic barriers to well-being, as we have done when we looked at institutional long-term care models. And we know that Maya Angelou said you did then what you knew how to do, and when you knew better, you did better. And DeWitt Jones, a wonderful photographer who does great videos on creativity, once said, patterns, structures, they're incredibly important. We can't function without them, but we all know that if we let these patterns go too long unquestioned, they become our prisons. And so we're questioning the pattern of memory care. And let's just start with a provocative question for you. Since most of you are affiliated with a dementia-friendly movement around the country, if a dementia-friendly community is defined as the community that seeks to include and engage those who live with dementia, then perhaps long-term care and assisted living communities are on track to become the most dementia-unfriendly parts of our society, because we are seeing growing trends of separating people who live with dementia within those communities or even separate communities altogether. So I'd like to give a brief history of where this came from. And once again, we're all doing better. Jennifer will tell you that she helped open the first memory care unit in the state of Washington. I certainly helped plan one of the first ones in the city of Rochester, both of us back in the late 90s. So we've certainly been down this road, but then at some point began to question this. And in that spirit, we will offer 5 arguments for possibly unlocking and desegregating memory care environments. And we're going to include what we call 5 positive pathways for inclusion. It'll be a lot more involved than what I can tell you in less than an hour, but we'll try to just give you an idea of what is involved in doing this as well as possible. The very first dementia-specific housing that we were able to identify was the Weiss Pavilion at the Philadelphia Geriatric Center in 1974. And the well-known architect, Dr. Powell Lawton, designed this. And it was not about separating people with dementia. It was really about creating an environment that was more enabling for them, because they felt that in traditional long-term care, they were not able to manage. And so they thought, well, how about a place especially designed to give better wayfinding, better opportunities for spontaneous interaction? And they put 40 resident rooms around a large open pavilion. Not long after that, a couple of Design for Dementia books came out. One called Design for Dementia, a little bit of a strange title there. Holding on to Home was written by the late Professor Jerry Weitzman, who just passed away this year, a great mentor of people like Emmy Kyoto, Maggie Calkins, Habib Chowdhury, and others, and Uriel Cohen. And then there were a couple of early dementia-specific assisted livings, once again, evaluating the impact of the physical environment on enabling people with dementia. And then there became a proliferation of special care units throughout nursing homes, throughout assisted living. General philosophy was maximizing quality of life by reducing environmental stressors. But there was a rapid explosion. By 2001, there were 300 special care units and 120,000 individual beds offered in the United States. 5 years later, 22% of U.S. long-term care homes had a special care unit, which outnumbered any other type of specialty unit. By 2012, 4,000 U.S. properties were offering what they call memory care. And we know that memory care doesn't have a specific definition or regulation, but it is the term that's most often used. And memory care units grew 55% up to 2018, and they continue to grow. I don't have any recent numbers, but we know that this is a growing trend. And it's not just happening in the US, but everywhere in at least the high-income countries around the world. So these are the 5 arguments I'm going to present for inclusion that we have developed. And I'll just go them first. First of all, the one we call the fallacy of homogeneity. In other words, the idea that people with dementia are enough alike that they should have one place to live, one type of approach to care, programming, etc. I wonder if this is not the biggest misconception in elder care. You have over 100 causes of dementia and forms. You have many variations, many people's level of ability. Each person has their own history, strengths, challenges, coping skills, cultural backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, spiritual backgrounds, 55 million people worldwide. So why do we have one-size-fits-all housing, care, and programming? So let me ask you some questions. And once again, you don't have to answer each question a certain way, but I'd like you to just think about these for yourself. If you were going to live somewhere in a congregate residential care environment, if you were diagnosed with dementia, would you want to live the rest of your life in a place that only had other people with a diagnosis of dementia living there? Or would you ever, for example, want to live in a home for people with high blood pressure? Or a home for former long-term care executives? Maybe that was your career. Please don't put me in the home for former doctors. I have no interest in that. The home for a certain race, religion, ethnicity. Now, we do see some of these that are created by choice. For instance, in Canada, there may be a Chinese or Ukrainian community who wants to provide a home buy-in for themselves. And it's one thing to do it by choice, but it's another thing that people decide that because you tick a certain box, you should be in a certain place. They're very different processes. The home for people who have the same school grade point average. Would you all want to be in people that had your B plus average or your A minus average or your C average? Would that make you a place where you be with people you want to be with? The reason I say this is because we not only have dementia-specific housing, but we have stage-specific housing. We take these very coarse, crude ways of staging people, and we say the people that score here should live together and the people that score there should live together. And I wonder if you lived in any of those places, do you think that defining a place by any of those things would make you seem like more or less of a unique individual? And lastly, do you think that separating people makes other people's fear about you and your condition and stigmas about you greater or less? 2 parts to the next question. Is it better care? There have been a number of studies on this, not nearly enough, but there are a few that we can refer to. The largest literature reviews generally done are from the group called the Cochrane Reviews. And they published an article quite a while ago, 15 years ago, where they looked at memory care at that time, and they found no important differences in the available studies. Of course, they were all non-randomized studies. It's hard to randomize people to memory care or not. But their conclusion was, and I quote, "It's probably more important to implement best practice than to provide a specialized care environment." Similarly, Grenier et al. Said that any important differences they found in homes that had special care units were more likely due to the care practices within the homes rather than the presence or actually the care within by separating people into the unit itself. Those homes tended to have both separate living areas and people with dementia also living in the general areas too. There was one that was a bit more positive. Joyce in 2018 did a MDS survey. That's a regulatory survey of all nursing homes, 16,000 of these, and looked at these and just went through all the data and thought maybe some trends suggesting better outcomes in homes that had special care units. They did a lot of mathematical calculations, but there are a lot of confounding factors. You can't really separate whether those homes, what their staffing levels were, what they thought appropriate staffing levels were, what their training was, what the overall work or care culture of the homes was, whether they had a lot of turnover, whether there were other struggles in those homes. So it's very hard to take 16,000 with a very crude instrument that comes out every quarter and really make a very clear conclusions about care. Another one looked at 108 studies from the US and other countries, found no evidence that special care units led to better care. So, not great. And what's the other half of the question? If it's not clearly better, are there worse outcomes? Well, there are several concerning studies. There was a study that came out in the Annals of Internal Medicine several years ago that looked at elder-to-elder mistreatment, as they called it, physical, verbal, or invasion of privacy. They found that to be significantly higher in special care units. Another one looked at veteran homes and found that those homes that had a special care unit had a 2/3 higher risk of getting antipsychotic drugs and higher incidence of resident mistreatment. Another study showed antipsychotic prescribing significantly higher within special care units. And another one looking at special care units in Alberta found that antipsychotic prescribing was significantly higher. And one by Kim Van Heetsma and others showed overall poorer outcomes many years ago for those living in special care units. Now, just to pause here for a moment, it might be reasonable to say, well, there's going to be more antipsychotics, there's going to be more resident-to-resident interaction because you're taking a group of people with dementia and you're cohorting them into a space that does not have people without dementia. And you might also expect, because they have this progressive illness, that there might be overall poorer outcomes. And as you look at that third bullet point, that is an argument. But if the evidence shows that people moving there will get a higher use of harmful drugs, higher exposure to potential abuse, what did we do for them by moving them there? What was the benefit for them of putting them in a place where they're more likely to have these ill outcomes? And just to clarify, once again, we can find good care in special care units. We can find good care in places that don't have special care units, and we can find bad care in both types of settings. But there's no compelling evidence that the actual segregation of the people is superior. And once again, a lot of evidence of increased potential for harm. Not only are locked doors not necessarily beneficial, but there is some evidence that they may actually be an important cause of distress in people with dementia. And there's a study that was done 30 years ago, which is still, we need more like this, but this is a very striking study because it says so much about this. And Namazi and Johnson looked at 22 people in a special care unit, and they just observed them 60 hours over a period of time when the doors were locked, 60 hours over a period of time when the doors were unlocked. They went back and forth, and they didn't do anything else different except open, unlock, or lock the doors. What they found was that there were a lot of anger and outbursts when the doors were locked, which was not only at the doors, banging on doors, etc., but also seen in other areas of the living area during personal care, etc. And they found that there were a total of over 1,500 what they called distressed expression, either verbal or physical or active responses. When the doors were unlocked, the same people trying to leave didn't go running for the exits. They would check the door to make sure it would open. They might step outside, even hold the door, look around, and then often just come back in. In other words, they wanted to know that they could leave if they had to. They told distressed expressions with the unlocked doors over 60 hours was 419. So let's look at those numbers. There are a couple different ways to look at those numbers. One is that when you locked the doors, you had a 3 2/3 fold increase in expressions of distress. Or you could say unlocking the doors led to a 73% decrease in expressions of distress. There was no other change. The only variable was forcing or not forcing confinement. So my question, because we see so many antipsychotics and other psychotropic drugs, how many people in our special care units who are getting these drugs are actually getting them primarily because of the distress, which was simply caused by locking the door? I'm going to come back to that later when we talk about risk. There's also a demographic argument, and I made this in my second book, and this is about aging in general, but also about dementia as a microcosm of aging. In 1950, there were about 12 working adults globally for every retired adult. By the year 2000, that ratio dropped to 9-1 because our population is aging. In 2025, it will be 4-1. So if we need lawyers, and if we need teachers, and if we need construction workers, and if we need doctors, and if we need other people in society, who is going to staff all those nursing homes that we build to accommodate a larger number of older people? The truth is that we cannot keep putting people into separate long-term care or assisted living communities because eventually there will be no one left to staff them. So the same reason the coming boom in people with dementia, which could be as much as 130 million by 2025, tells us that we've got to stop building separate areas because we all need to be more inclusive of people with dementia, and we need to keep people in communities much longer than we have been doing to date. One more argument. Oh yeah, just another point about this is that there are nearly 16,000 nursing homes. If you look at the numbers, and particularly the dark purple on the bar for either nursing homes or assisted living residential care communities, you'll see that still the vast majority, nearly about 80% of people with dementia do not live in separate wings. So there are plenty of people who are doing this kind of care right now who are not separating people. And there's a lot we can learn from that. And we should, rather than just saying memory care is the way of the future, say, well, how come 80% of the people don't seem to need that? And what can we learn from that? Argument number 5. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm still here. So once again, and this is a friend of ours from the greenhouse homes I helped open in Rochester, New York, who was delighted when she moved into a small house of 12 people with and without dementia, who were so well known by their consistently assigned care partners that nobody needed ID bracelets anymore, even though the state was worried that we misrecognize people. When you're in a small environment like that, you know who everybody is. The vast majority of people with dementia do not live in locked segregated memory care. So what can we learn? Okay, number 5, the last one, but maybe the most important one, and that is the civil rights argument. I'm a child of the civil rights movement, so I lived through a lot of the particularly stressful time of civil rights, late 50s, 60s, into the 70s, and I would argue still going on to a great extent. But we have to ask ourselves, who else besides convicted felons is forced to live behind a locked door and away from the rest of us? This is the recommendation that Jennifer referred to. The Nevada State Plan, the right to choice in care settings. This cites the U.S. Constitution. About liberty interests, it cites the Olmstead versus LC decision from 1999 in the Supreme Court, saying that persons with disabilities constitutes a violation of ADA unless it is the least restrictive opportunity. And we do consider, and the World Health Organization considers dementia to be a cognitive disability. That doesn't mean there isn't disease present, but it means that from a social model of accommodation and community, dementia serves as a potential disability when we do not accommodate people in the way that we do other types of disabilities. The key nursing home assisted living resident rights that we might refer to here: respect and dignity, self-determination, and as Casey says, the idea of freedom, freedom from abuse and from restraints, including environmental restraints. So what are the antidotes, the fears we have? Well, we need to educate everybody. And that includes not only the people that work in long-term care, we need to educate the people that live there who might think that people with dementia shouldn't live with them. We need to educate families. We need to educate attorneys. We need to educate the media. We need to educate regulators, everybody. We need to work to destigmatize dementia so people don't have irrational fears about what it's all about. We need to build relationships and deep knowing, because when you get to know somebody beyond their label, you have a different appreciation for them and their abilities and capabilities and possibilities. We need a well-communicated, value-based organizational philosophy. We're going to come back to that. And we need enlightened practices that facilitate well-being for all. So how can we move down the track to moving away from separate areas? Well, first of all, one more bit of surprising news. Jennifer and Pat and I discovered this when speaking with elder rights attorneys in referencing and researching our book. We found out that U.S. law states that the only person who can decide a person with dementia must live in secured housing are either the person with dementia themselves, or if they don't want to live there, the only other person is a court-appointed guardian, not a healthcare surrogate, not a doctor, not a long-term care operator, not a lawyer. There have been successfully litigated cases with tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines imposed when people have been able to find advocates who are willing to sue for false imprisonment. So we have to ask the question, how many people in special care units who don't want to be there are actually being illegally confined in the various states of the country? This is kind of a sad truth before we move to the positive side. I believe that even though we want better care, I don't think that's the real reason why most housing is built. I think that goal is overshadowed by two bigger goals. That is confining people against leaving because of the risk of people leaving unattended. And number two, taking the individuals from other people who are driven by ageism and ableism and liability concerns that say we don't want those people around us because of the myths and stigmas and fears about dementia. Megan Graham, who wrote a wonderful article about this 4 or 5 years ago, said that dementia is being socially constructed, no longer as a medical disease, but primarily an issue of security. And what risk do people pose is more important in many ways than what are their medical needs, what are their care needs, what are their well-being needs. So 5 positive pathways to inclusion. I'm going to go through very quickly. There'll be a big part of the book, many thousands of words, but time is of the essence. And these are put in an order which I'm going to suggest for a reason, and I'll get to that about halfway through. The first one is just reframing our view of dementia. The second is focusing on well-being, not just illness. The third is creating an enabling environment. The fourth is leveraging our collective capacity through dialogue. And the fifth is negotiating risk, an all-important one. So what does reframing dementia mean? Well, it doesn't mean we invent anything new. It doesn't mean that we think that dementia is not real or that there isn't brain disease. But we're taking a very old condition and we're looking at it with what Marcel Proust called different eyes. And we're expanding our view beyond just very narrow, medically oriented structures or rules or approaches. And we emphasize the importance of learning from people living with the condition and trying to appreciate each person's perspective. One of the first things I did to reframe dementia for myself when I worked on my first book over 15 years ago was to rewrite a definition of dementia that wouldn't lock me into judgment or into over-medicalized views of people. And the definition I wrote is dementia is a shift in the way people experience the world around them. I've evolved my thinking a lot. This is the only thing that I've not changed in the past 15 years, other than going gender neutral with the definition. So where does that simple mindset change lead? Well, it can lead from seeing a fatal disease to seeing, as we said, different abilities. When I met my greatest mentor, the late Dr. Richard Taylor, who lived with Alzheimer's for 15 years and thought about it before dying, ironically, of cancer, not of Alzheimer's. The first time I heard him speak, he said, "I'm not dying of a fatal disease. I'm living with a chronic disability." And he changed my focus from dying to living and from fatal disease to disability or different ability. And it made me think of people with other types of disabilities and the idea of ramps. If you have a wheelchair, we don't ask you to walk upstairs, we give you a ramp. But no matter where you live, from home to nursing home, if you have dementia, we're not accommodating. We're not giving you cognitive ramps. We're expecting people to follow our view of the world, our rules, our schedules, our rhythms, our staffing needs. And if people can't, then we diagnose behavior problems and give them dangerous medications. Kind of like asking a person in a wheelchair to walk upstairs. And if they can't, and they get upset with you saying they have a behavior problem, and give an antipsychotic. This is the same thing that we do. It means that we can help people to grow. And that if we can't cure dementia, which we cannot do, what are those universal human needs that we should be fulfilling? It led me to challenge the ways we look at distress, challenge a lot of our care practices, such as this talk. And it also kind of turns the expertise pyramid upside down because, if somebody doesn't want to shower and is resisting you, what we normally do now in long-term care is we pick up the phone and call the doctor. Now, I can tell you as a doctor that no one in medical school taught me how to give somebody a shower. They did give me a lot of education on how to prescribe pills. So if you call me up, generally from a doctor, that's what they're expecting you to be asking for, is a prescription. And when you redefine dementia, instead of complex neurologic processes, which the specialists are the experts in, if you diagnose dementia as a shift in how people experience the world around them, Then who are the experts? Well, now the experts are the person with the diagnosis and those who are closest to that person. And so now we don't bring doctors into discussions like this when the people who know that person and who have a relationship with that person are the best equipped to come up with a better approach, hopefully in some sort of collaboration with the person whenever possible. The second one is focusing on well-being, and this is a framework for well-being from the Eden Alternative that I've been using for many years. And these are 7 universal human needs. We're not talking about dementia, we're talking about people, human beings. We all need identity, connectedness, security, autonomy, meaning, growth, and joy, no matter who we are, no matter what our background is, or whether we live with a diagnosis or not. One of the problems I realized when I started looking through the lens of this well-being framework was that we're really not taught about this. We're taught about lots of ways to provide so-called care to people with dementia, but we're not taught about the important need for these things, which maybe people with dementia cannot that easily maintain on their own. And we don't think about how we, number one, could be better supporting these domains of well-being, or about how our care approaches and our systems of care actually can erode these domains of well-being. And so we've developed an approach to people with distress, which focuses, instead of saying these are symptoms of brain disease, to saying, let's find out what's missing in a person's well-being domains and see if maybe that's contributing to their distress. And if we can look at that as 7 drinking glasses that need to be filled, can we proactively fill those glasses and help people to not only feel better, but to not even have the distress in the first place? So this rejects the concept that people's actions and words are what we call behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia. That dementia may certainly affect how you react in a situation, but it's really the root cause. It looks deeper to find deficits in those domains of well-being and then uses a proactive strength-based process to replenish them. And it's optimized with shifts in operations and the built environment. And remind me to say something again about operations when I get to our 5th pathway, because it's an important part that needs to be re-emphasized. So let's look again at reframing dementia. Why do people try to leave? Are they really wanderers or exit seekers? Well, the first reason we have to remember is that walking is a normal daily human function. You and I walk through doors every single day. Nobody stops us, and we don't think anything of it. So when we use terms like wandering or elopement behavior, we're using labels that judge and pathologize the person. So people may want to leave just because they want to walk, they want to explore, they want to go through that door. There's nothing pathological about that. But there are 2 other reasons too. If people seem distressed and are trying to get out, maybe they're trying to find something that is not there, or maybe they're trying to get away from something that is there. And as Casey said, we don't want something that's home-like. We want a place that has the attributes of true home. And that's something that people are either looking for or getting away from. It's usually not a concrete thing. It's usually not the house at 35 Maple Street, but it's actually often needs that are rooted in those 7 domains of well-being. A few more examples just to reframe our attitude. Trying to exit living areas is not abnormal. The only abnormal thing is that we're locking a door and telling people they can't go out. Resisting being undressed by someone you don't recognize is not abnormal. If we did it on the street, that would be an arrest for assault. Wanting to do things our way, at our pace, on our terms is never abnormal. And here's another important one. Being angry if we've expressed a concern to someone and they try to correct us, distract us, redirect us, or lie to us is not abnormal. If you express a concern to a loved one or a supervisor and they try to say, hey, how about those 4 Buffalo Bills last night losing by 2 points? Would you really feel like that person cares about you or heard a word you said? So when we redirect people with dementia, aren't we really just kind of ignoring what they're trying to tell us? So these are things that are taught in dementia care, and this leads us to challenge them and say, we got to go deeper. We're missing the point here. Number 3, and this is Jennifer's big deal, leveraging our collective capacity. I'm making Jennifer take the lead in this chapter because she knows it so much better than I do. But very quickly, the idea is that we need to use relationships and communication through dialogue to embrace the complexity of dementia support. There's no simple formulas for dementia. There's no algorithms for dementia. it is complex because we're dealing with unique human beings with very complex brains that are each experiencing those brain changes in a very unique way. So we have to talk about this, and we have to have people that can talk to the person and failing that, know that person as well as possible. And I'm just going to very quickly go over a couple of things here, not to shortchange a very important part, but to really keep the dialogue going. And this is a great set of diagrams that Jennifer set up. This is what a care setting can look like without consistent assignments and daily shift huddle. So remember, we said relationships and communication are key. If you don't know a person, it's very hard to support their well-being. It's very hard to take risks to have people do things like exit the door if you don't know anything about them or their capabilities. So one of the operational things, I said, remind me to come back to, is that anyone who provides dementia care needs to have consistent staff assignments, not rotating staff assignments, not lots of agency people coming in who don't know the person. And Jennifer has come up with a system of daily shift huddle, which when combined with my well-being approach, really helps people fill those glasses in a very effective and deeply knowing way. If you don't have consistent assignments and you don't have huddles and no one's talking to each other, nobody knows how this poor person in the middle has needs that can be met. And so effective care planning and problem solving have a big stop sign. On the other hand, if you have consistent assignments, people who know each other, people who know the person, people who work with each other, people who have daily shift huddles and lots of dialogue, then we have lots of open communication, and you can find even the toughest of solutions when you do that. Number 4, creating enabling environments. And this is 2 things. One of them is the built environment. Number 2, using enabling technology. And once again, I'm not an expert in either of these. I'm going to talk about them very briefly because what's more important is the mindset than actually what we use. In technology, let's face it, by the time I finish this talk, anything I mentioned to you is probably going to be obsolete. One thing I did do, though, at the Research Institute up in Canada, where I work part-time, was to co-develop a resource guide. And this we can, by the way, we can make a handout of this talk available to everyone. We can load this into the chat for people who want to see it. It's a free download. And it not only looks at things like lighting and sound and wayfinding cues and all the built environment things, but it also looks at things like how's the environment support well-being, how does the environment support relationships, how does the environment support operations, or how do operations potentially get in the way of an enabling environment. And so this is just one thing that we've tried to do. And I just want to make a point that I thought of when working on this, and that is think of all the things we do in memory care to try to keep people from trying to leave. We do structural things like putting doors on parallel walls so they're not at the end of the hall where they're easy to see. We potentially put potentially confusing murals to disguise doors, like things that look like bookshelves, which are just more confusing because why is the bookshelf flat and I can't grab these books? We come up with circular paths so people can go round and around the racetrack. We also do programming things like activity stations that are supposed to keep people busy, but they're often childish. You know, artificial kitchens we have, stores, fake bus stops that buses never come to, or putting people in meaningless repetitive activities. But just imagine, if we could find a safe way to open the door, we wouldn't have to do any of this stuff. We could throw all that stuff in the trash and just go on to living normally. Enabling technology, just a couple things, just a couple quotes from people who know a lot more about this than I do, and it's about the assumptions. It's about the mindset of technology, not the gadget. My dear friend and mentor, Emmy Keogh, the environmental gerontologist, said, one of the defining features of home is that the place you return to. If you can never leave a place, it will never feel like home. That kind of turns our idea about home on its ear, doesn't it? I love that quote. Eleanor Bantry White, a social work professor in Ireland, who gave the best technology talk I've ever heard, talked about assumptions. Technology discussion should start by challenging the assumptions we make in designing technology. For example, who defines what risk is? What does safe mean to the person with dementia versus those around them? Who's the technology for? How much room for error is allowed? And what happens when the care partner, who's supposed to be the carer, becomes a surveillance person? There is, for home and community-based living, there is a great group called the International Consortium for Dementia and Wayfinding, and you can also get tools for community living there as well. And that's all I'm going to say about these today. But the caution, do these in order. The reason I say start with reframing dementia, focusing on well-being, and creating capacity through dialogue is that every decision you will make about the built environment and about technology will be influenced by how you see dementia and how you see the rights of people with dementia. And if we don't shift ourselves from a very paternalistic mindset, then we're going to create nice looking prisons for people instead of enabling places. This is the tough one. This is the deal breaker for most people that understand the rights of people with dementia to have freedom. So let's just talk about risk, because it's not just all or none. First of all, everything we choose to do has the potential for both positive and negative outcomes. You can call it upside risk or downside risk, and you can call it downside risk versus potential for benefit. Everything we choose not to do also has the potential for both positive and negative outcomes. And remember that positive and negative outcomes can arise indirectly and unexpectedly. We learned this in the COVID pandemic. We did things that we thought would stop the spread of the virus because they were all about infection control, isolation, protective equipment, hand washing, keeping visitors away. But what caused a lot of death and suffering? Loneliness, isolation, over medication of people who couldn't be isolated, people who gave up, people who could not get routine medical care because they were being kept in lockdown. So that's not to say we should have let people roam freely. I'm not quite to that extent, like some people are advocating. But the idea is that risk can come from places besides good hand washing or wearing gowns properly. And so it's not just either or. And what that tells us is there is no risk-free choice. There's no risk-free environment. So we should never ask what's the risk of doing something like unlocking a door, without also asking, well, what's the risk of not doing it, keeping the door locked? Surplus safety means we spend too much concern with the negative outcomes compared to the positive ones. And this is endemic in residential care. And surplus safety also erodes critical thinking skills. Individual values and risk tolerance need to be considered. And rather than all or none, let's try to negotiate risk by finding a solution that maximizes the positive while also minimizing the negative. Neither one's going to be 100% or zero, but we do the best we can. And there's also a great new resource out from Professor Liza Behrens at Penn State, where they're putting a systemized way into assessing risk and helping support people's dignity by coming up with ways to honor that person's wishes as safely as possible. Back to Namazi and Johnson, though. We know the injury and death after leaving a living area is a serious concern. We're not trying to minimize that. But we also know antipsychotics cause death too, and injury. They have been proven to cause significantly increased risk for death, stroke, heart attacks, pneumonia, faster cognitive decline, falls, movement disorders in people with dementia. The Namazi and Johnson study showed that locked doors were a primary cause of most of the threat, nearly 80%. So how many people in special care units are on antipsychotics primarily because the door is locked? And how many people are suffering other emotional effects of confinement beyond the drugs, like isolation, lack of movement, lack of sunlight, poor sleep, or just giving up, that sort of prisoner of war mentality? Have we made them safer by locking the door? I would argue that in our current system, many more people suffer and die within locked units than those who actually get out and suffer an injury outside the unit. And what if those media and regulators who are promoting and publicizing every death or injury from leaving a building also wrote up every death or injury that came from the drugs and what they do to the people that we're giving them to? So a few approaches to negotiating risk before I even get to this list, a couple. The first one is to hold dialogue with everybody in your organization. I talked about this before and focused on the why. Why should we be inclusive? What is the reason? What is the philosophy underneath it? In culture change, people tend to focus on the how. So let's come up with a breakfast buffet. Let's try doing some staff self-scheduling. And, those are all nice things. But the problem with focusing on the how is if you don't have a deeply rooted philosophy. When the inevitable hard times come, a bad survey or a pandemic or whatever comes down the road, staff turnover, then these initiatives tend to fall down. But if you have settled on a strongly value-based approach, why we're doing it, and agreed that this is important, then those are just bumps in the road, and you will come back and you will continue to move down that path because you know that it's important. The second thing is to have, as I said before, a strongly enunciated organizational philosophy. If you're going to have a statement on your front door of non-discrimination based on race, ethnicity, religion, etc., then why not have dementia, cognitive function, added to that statement and let people know up front, this is who you are, this is what you practice, this is what you believe. Beyond that, do the 5 practical pathways. Now look at those first 4, okay? I believe that if you reframe dementia, if you focus on well-being in a systematic way, if we have consistent assignments and use dialogue to help collaborate in solving people's needs, and if we create an enabling environment and use technology respectfully but in an enabling way, I believe that over 95% of the risk of a person getting hurt leaving that door has been eliminated just by going through these preliminary steps. Then you start negotiating risk on top of it, and you really are not in nearly as dangerous a situation as it seems, because most of the people are leaving because they're in a place that doesn't support their well-being, that doesn't know what they need or what they're doing, and so it's chaos. So of course there's risk. Consistent, deep knowing team assignments. Continuing the operational culture change process. And once again, this is where I talk about operations. We need consistent assignment. We need to create operations and systems that are flexible. One size fits all fits no one. So everybody, particularly those who seem to be at most risk of perhaps getting in trouble if they leave, they need to have individualized care plans. Instead of locking in 30 people, take the 3 or 4 that you're most concerned about and come up with a way to keep them safe, and you will have kept everybody safe. You can also move incrementally, widen the safe perimeters. You don't have to alarm the door. You can alarm the door to the outside. You can only use monitoring technology in people that need it, not everybody. There's lots of ways you can move in a stepwise fashion. And work proactively with all stakeholders. Pat Sprigg was on the call. Will tell you that Carol was, they had an all hands on deck mentality. They knew the people that they needed to keep an eye on. They could communicate with each other. If they saw somebody looking different or talking differently, or maybe going somewhere where they didn't usually go, they could keep eyes on people. They didn't just have a place where nobody had a clue who was coming and who was going. But we need to advocate for the rights of our most vulnerable citizens, because that ultimately will lead to our own rights. And be humble. This is not easy work, but it's very important. Another sad truth, unfortunately, this still is lost on the media, the regulators, lawyers, and society in general. There's a basic conflict inherent in regulations, which tell people you have to respect resident rights, but you also have to keep them safe. And studies show over and over that when those two come into conflict, regulators and families and staff all together will invariably take away the person's rights in deference to their own safety concern. Graham said that it appears security is prioritized above resident agency, dignity, and sense of self. And there's another wonderful article about fencing by Shoshona Dreyfus and Lynn Phillipson and Richard Fleming in Australia. And they talked about all the things that family members and staff members said, empathizing about how trapped people felt with a fenced-in living area, but then every single one of them said, but we needed to keep them safe. And what the authors said was that the fence became a symbol of something that supports the emotional safety of the family members and the staff, while at the same time depriving the residents of that same emotional safety. So who are these for, really? And are we really supporting the people we're supposed to be caring for? I have lots of other stories to go on, but we're getting toward the top of the hour. And I think what I want to do is just get beyond that and just go to a quote by Pat Sprigg at the end here, who's on the call. I just think it's a wonderful quote. It's a culture change that negotiated risk, elevated education, change of language, collective wisdom, understanding well-being and the various aspects. I mean, all those things are critically important if someone wants to do this. You cannot just unlock a door. And I will ask you all, because culture change is not for the people there today. It takes a long time. Culture change is ultimately for maybe the next generation, maybe ourselves. So if we don't start changing the practice now, who's going to do it before you or I end up living in a lot area? So I'm going to stop there because I want to leave a little bit of time. I'm sure there's comments or questions. And thank you all so much for listening and for being here on this call today.